ask you what these institutions have in common. Especially institutions called etc. Could have done with a little bit more editing, or Hanover. What they all have in common, of course, is that they all run very recently, or are actually now running courses in values in science. This was just a random selection, of course. And I located them all by simply doing a search on course, university, argument from inductive risk. Just to check that this is indeed still current. Certainly is. I know that Miklos, for example, has done a course here in Values in Science, not perhaps this year, Miklos, but recently.
It's a bit of an overstatement, but values in science were covered in the philosophy of science course. That's the more precise statement. But not this year, that's correct.
Okay. The other thing I'd quite like to know, with a sort of hands up, because it's helpful for me to know how much to press certain points, is how many people, roughly speaking, are familiar with the argument from inductive risk. That's very helpful. Okay. All right. Well, the inductive risk argument. AIR, as it's sometimes called. What I'm going to argue here, essentially, is that I think they call the takeaway from the talk, is that there's something, on the one hand, helpful about the argument from inductive risk, that it does point out useful, in some interesting aspects of how values are involved in science, where science has to be fairly loosely defined, rather broadly defined, to include a lot of activities done by scientists. It also, as we will discover, Richard Jeffrey, I think, was one of the first to point it out, it also puts a bit of pressure on people who want to keep social values to some extent to the corners, if you like, of science, to put it that way. It puts pressure on them to interpret science in a particular way. In particular, jumping ahead, to be very careful about acceptance. This key word, to be very careful about acceptance. You'll see what I have in mind. Oh, it's also, by the way, sometimes called the underdetermination argument, because it focuses such a lot on the idea that various decisions in science are undetermined, and that this is where values come in the gaps. Here's Richard Rudner, 1953, his very well-known paper on which a lot of these ideas were based, and which was revived by Heather Douglas, who I think her doctoral thesis was on this. The scientist, he says in the title of his paper, the scientist, quasi-scientist, makes value judgments, he said. I mean, this is the sort of statement, as you'll see, my background is in physics, this is the sort of statement that tends to make me feel rather upset. And that's not good, that's not a philosophical argument, but it's actually, you'll see that's quite important to my talk as well. It's quite relevant that it makes me feel upset, because clearly there's really quite a lot of people that it doesn't make them upset. And this distinction is of interest. It doesn't seem to be intellectual, but it's of interest, this distinction. I knew when I read the title of his paper, I thought, I don't think I'm going to like this. Since, he writes, no scientific hypothesis is ever completely verified. That's the underdetermination. In accepting a hypothesis, the scientist must make the decision that the evidence is sufficiently strong, phrase repeatedly used by Heather Douglas, that the probability is sufficiently high to warrant the acceptance of the hypothesis. Obviously, he often says obviously. Surely that's a, surely, and obviously that's a warning sign in any philosopher. If you ever found yourself typing obviously, stop. Obviously, he says, our decision regarding the evidence and respecting how strong is strong enough is going to be a function of the importance in the typically ethical, social sense of making a mistake in accepting or rejecting the hypothesis. Our decision regarding that, read it again, our decision regarding the evidence and respecting how strong is strong enough for acceptance is going to be a function of the importance of in the typically social or ethical sense of making a mistake in accepting or rejecting a hypothesis.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay. So my arguments are going to be, not my arguments, our arguments. A lot of them involve Richard Jeffries' work, in particular Isaac Levy, people from, to be honest, long ago, but also some other people like Sandra Mitchell. It's going to be a local value-free ideal. I will explain what that means a little bit. A global value-free ideal is absurd. It's a straw man or an Aunt Sally, but it is still a target for people who are keen on values. We are going to be only thinking about a local value-free ideal. Okay. Here's what we're going to do. The essential bit is going to be here, of course, three aspects of the argument from inductive risk. There's quite a lot of further matters. I put all those into, as it were, the extra stuff. If you're interested, some of you may well be interested in some of those. We can discuss those after I finish the main strand of all of this. Okay. Maybe emphasize perhaps that by values there's a lot of discussion on what we're going to mean by values in this sort of work. By values I am meaning social values. So I'm not thinking about epistemic values, not yet. I'm specifically thinking of social values. Okay. Now, I was talking about local rather than global value-free ideal. This is very important. I noticed when I was practicing this talk, I kept saying, and this is very important. I remember then I suspect it's a verbal tick from my years as a school teacher in classes. Now this is very important. Why aren't you listening? So I apologize if I keep saying, every slide, this is very important. Okay, this is quite important. The flow of stages of a scientific investigation. And perhaps I could just mention, just because I've got it written down here, that of course this work is normative and not descriptive. Surely that goes without saying. You can't argue for any of this with case studies. You can't argue with examples. You can only argue, as philosophers here, by illustrations. I'll give you an illustration, and by abstract argument. It's a normative claim, of course, that science should be, some of it, ideally value-free. Well, you've had time to have a look at some of these things. It's colourful. You might have, sure you didn't think this is just on random colours. Obviously not. The red is the bits which I would claim need to be value-free. The bits that are, if you like, factual, which are purely evidence-based. You can see there's not many of them. And I'm only going to focus on this one. Matthew Brown very recently wrote a review article in Synthesa, and he implies that my approach here is what he calls, very tendentiously, value management, he says, i.e. I'm really one of them, in that of course I know values are riddled all over science. I'm just managing the role of them. I suggest in my upcoming, perhaps, paper for Mr. Brown, that what he's engaging in is epistemology management. It's just where you start from. I reckon that, of course, there are values in science, and the values are the green, and just to take an obvious one, choosing the area that scientists investigate is, of course, an area which can and perhaps should be influenced by social values. If someone decides they want to do research into, as we will see, the carcinogenic effects of dioxin, someone else says they'd like to work on torpedoes. There are social considerations that perhaps should come into that choice. That makes sense. Notice in particular, perhaps, that down here it goes completely green. This is very important because this is where acceptance starts to appear. This is Richard Jeffries' insight, in my opinion, that acceptance, which Douglas says is at the heart of science, you can see I place, not especially controversially, at the end. And acceptance in the sense of policy making is right down the end. Would you say that Boris Johnson or someone, in accepting in some sense that the virus is replicating at a certain rate in the pandemic and therefore we should close the schools, we wouldn't call him a scientist. He is their policy making. Finally, note this very interesting, use that word for a change, that bit there, another acceptance, but apparently off on a bit of a side branch of the flow. Okay. I suggested that proposing that the value-free ideal applies to all of science is a straw man. Listen to Matthew Brown. There is a near consensus, he says, this is one reason for the talk. There is a near consensus, he wrote in 2024, that the value-free ideal is untenable. So, and he is very clearly referring, as far as I can tell, to everything here. Which again gives me sort of high blood pressure, really. Okay. I said we can't work with case studies. Shouldn't do, it's normative. But we could have an example, an illustration, and I've used the dioxin illustration with the same colour scheme because it's a favourite of Heather Douglas. Don't need to know anything special about it, but you can see I've simply got examples of all the various stages as they would apply to dioxin. And I've asterisked here the one red, what I consider as factual epistemic stage, a stage, to be more careful, which can be completely guided by only epistemic considerations. You know, when you've gone over these topics enough, you get these phrases going round and round in my mind. It's tempting to call it factual, but that's no good for philosophers. So we have to have a much more careful expression, of course. Okay. This is a rough cut. We're working our way towards, of course, my eye on the time, but we're working our way towards the three key arguments we're going to discuss. They're not far away. This is a very rough distinction between people like me and people like Heather Douglas and Richard Radner. People like Hempel, Nagel, Richard Jeffrey, Isaac Levy, who you may not especially have heard of, Hugh Lacey's a significant recent philosopher, John Norton, Gregor Betts, who revived some aspects, very, I think unsuccessfully, of Jeffrey's approach, Karl Popper, watching down on us, Imre Lakatosh, epistemologists. This, I think is what has upset some, what I would think of as valuists. I mean, I think that's a pretty fair, if you like, description or, you know, of philosophy of science in the mid to late 20th century. It's all about epistemology. It's all about the methodology of scientific research programs. It's all about the logic of scientific discovery. And values and social issues are of no interest, really, to Popper or to Lakatos, or at least not when they're doing their philosophical work. I'm not saying they're not interested in those things, but not when they're doing their philosophical work. What's really interesting is, can you ultimately verify a scientific hypothesis, or can you only falsify it? Are scientific theories, do they develop in a certain way, in a haze of counterfactual counterfacts, and with a hard core and so on? These ideas which you recognize, which have, it's not so much they have nothing to do with values. What I'm getting at here is the drive of epistemologists, of which I think I am one, is to just not be particularly interested in these other issues. And you might think, what philosophers are interested in doesn't really matter. Well, I think in this particular topic, it matters a lot. This is meta-philosophy, of course. I think it matters a lot where you come from into this area, the philosophy of science. Do you come from physics like me? Do you come from history? Do you come from an interest in social matters? Are you, slightly sensitively, male or female? Pretty much all of these epistemologists were male. Really quite a lot of valuists are female. Notably feminist philosophers of science with their standpoint theory. But you might say, well, that's just because more women have appeared in philosophy of science since the late 20th century. True, I'm not convinced that's all there is to it. We could discuss that. Well, that's, I think, where we are now. Quite upsetting for an epistemologist like me. Not really, but I think that's where we are now. The consensus does really seem to be, in published work, I'm not sure about, if you just ask lots of people, but in published work, perhaps at conferences, this consensus seems to be that there's values absolutely everywhere in science. I don't know if anyone recognises that phrase, which was a favourite of our late mentor, Karl Popper. What is our problem? What he would do, and certainly Heinz Post, who I knew better at Chelsea, if even quite a distinguished presenter started off presenting a talk and saying, Post would interrupt, that's the professor, and he'd say, Dr. So-and-so, what's your problem? He said it in a very unpleasant way, and the presenter was very rattled. But I sort of saw what he meant, by it, in this aggressive and unpleasant way, like Popper, of course, aggressive and unpleasant. There should be something you're trying to solve in your presentation, rather than just talking about stuff for an hour or so. Yeah, it's true. So what is my problem? Well, obviously, my problem is science ideally value-free? For some particular purpose. Suppose the purpose, a bit complicated this slide, sorry about that. Suppose the purpose is social benefit, and the social benefit of science is going to be its ability to find the truth or knowledge. Just think about that for a moment. So it's a two-stage thing. The science is going to find the truth as best it can, and society is going to benefit because of the truth-seeking process, characteristic of scientists. Is that process, all of it, ideally value-free? No. As already discussed. No. Everybody agrees. No. So let's try another one. We come to some. I think this is quite weighty, actually. Let's come to some. Is some science, thinking of our flow, ideally value-free just for truth-seeking? Yes. Well, I certainly think it is. A number of other people think it is. And I think there's a hint, it's not discussed, I've noticed, that valuists think that that's true, it's just not interesting. Literally, it's not interesting. Because they're not interested in truth-seeking. Now, it's quite an extreme thing to say, but it isn't really, is it? They're interested in benefiting society. And in some odd way, I'm not. Not as much as Heather Douglas is, or Matthew Brown. I can feel it in their writings. I've been a physicist, if you like, all my life, and a theoretical sort of philosopher. I'm not that interested in benefiting society, not as a gut feeling. I have to wind myself up to it. Think, oh, yes, we should try to benefit society. But really, I'm interested in pulsars and, and quarks. There's a big difference there. Heather Douglas only really refers to pure truth-seeking without values in a footnote to her 2019 book. It's just a footnote where she says, scientific investigations without values are just a special case, she says, of my theory. I think it's her only reference to it. Finally then, we have, of course, in effect going back to the first aim, is some science ideally value-free, I think I just mean free without the R, is some science ideally value-free via finding the truth for social benefit? Yes. I think think some science, you've got to sort of think what we're saying here. Finding the truth in some stages of science specifically to benefit society, are there some stages that should be value-free, ideally? I say yes, as you know. I don't think valuists really discuss that, as far as I can tell. Or they discuss it with this lack of interest, just scattered about here and there. What are some, you know what I'm already going to say, what are some of these areas which perhaps ideally should be value-free? You might think, well, maybe the valuists will agree. Well, certainly some valuists think that classifying uncertain observations as either the rat's liver under the microscope is cancerous or it isn't cancerous in the dioxin case. Heather Douglas thinks that that decision should be influenced by values. That she thinks that the microbiologist should be looking at the slide and looking through the microscope and thinking, I'm not sure if this rat's liver, who's been exposed to dioxin, I'm not sure if this liver is cancerous or not. I'll note it down, she implies, as cancerous, applying a precautionary principle, being socially responsible. So think about that suggestion. I'm inclined to think it's really fundamentally dangerous. I've used that word to the extent any philosophy is relevant to the outside world. That's a genuinely dangerous attitude that the scientist there, the person, should be recording an observation that they're not sure about. They should record it as cancerous because of the implications of it socially. As it happens, I'm not really going to discuss that case, but we could, if you like. That's the one, of course, I am going to discuss. I think we maybe get the first appearance of a probabilistic notation, which is not relevant to the talk at all. And we talked about the stream. Upstream cases, they will typically, really quite often, think that all three of these should involve values for social reasons, which to my mind doesn't leave anything very much, and indeed to their mind, doesn't leave anything very much which doesn't involve values. And I think that's, I'll read you some quotations later on, I think that's right.
Excuse me? What K stands for?
Say again?
What K stands for?
Oh, thank you. Yes, K is I think, a fairly I don't mean to be critical. It's a fairly common notation for background knowledge. I think it's basically K for knowledge. Sorry, thank you for that. So, yes, so this is the probability of the hypothesis that dioxin is carcinogenic, given the observations on rats' livers, let's say, and background evidence that we have that rats' physiology is similar to human. Something like that. Okay. Yeah. Well, never mind global value-free ideal, which is, I think I used the word absurd for. What about all the cases which are value-laden? And I personally have learnt about these from valuists over many years. If you like, I've learnt to take a bit more notice of society, perhaps, than of just physics. Choosing the area you research in. Choosing the parameter. Some of the parameters, given a choice, why do some climate scientists choose to emphasize sea levels? It's an example that's often been used by valuists, rather than sea temperature. Well, perhaps because they live in New York or London. They are worried about sea levels. They think sea levels are important to society. They're not so sure about the temperature. And that is a genuine reason, and there may not be very much epistemic guidance as to what parameter to choose, so why not choose sea level? Fine. Hadn't occurred to me till I read Weinberg's paper on that, or whoever it was. If you were doing cost of living index, which I happen to be reading about, how you characterize the cost of living index. Do you take notice of just what people overall buy per week? Or do you focus on what much poorer people buy each week? Because you personally are more concerned socially about poorer people. So the cost of foreign holidays isn't going to come up. Maybe the cost of petrol isn't going to come up because they're not wealthy enough to have a car. So your basket of items for your cost of living index is adjusted on the basis of your social values. Yeah. Another one I learned. Obvious one. The one I discussed about looking at, no, sorry, not the one I discussed. That's one we could discuss in the later conversation, if you like. You might have thought that I think that that is value-free, but I don't think it is. Slightly subtle reason. Here we come into accepted. Just read that one. Publicize is a key word. I don't mean publicize within the scientific community there. Not academically publicizing to the public, to the newspapers. And that we already talked about. It's quite a long list, there's plenty more. And I know, and I'm emphasizing this point, I know that they don't particularly interest me. I was very interested when I found out about 4, because that hadn't struck me. But mostly for the others, I think, yeah. Rather like Heather Douglas, I suppose, looks at the logic of scientific discovery and thinks, yeah. It's a personal thing. What's my thesis here? That there is at least one ideally value-free truth-seeking station. This is it. Judging the extent of evidential support for a hypothesis. Doesn't feel terribly controversial to me. Becomes slightly more controversial, I know, if I make it probability, H given, because I appear to be a Bayesian, but it doesn't have to be put that way. I'm tempted to say, using old-fashioned, I think, philosophy language, this is a crucial internal stage in science. but the internal-external distinction is pretty dodgy. So I would just say something like, it seems very important for truth-seeking. Now, you might think, maybe these valuers basically accept that. They do not accept that that is value-free. They do not. And they don't mind. They don't mind that it's imbued with values. We've got three arguments, you may remember that from the summary. And they don't quite go down, in fact, they don't at all, I come to think of it, they don't come down the flow of stages, because that wouldn't make sense logically. First of all, we've got acceptance. Subscripts. No one's asked me about subscripts, but you might have been thinking it. The subscripts, can I say of course, are, because these terms are slippery, acceptance X means acceptance in at least three different senses. Importantly different, at least three different senses. And in stuff, sort of writing, we have acceptance T, which is acceptance purely for truth purposes. We have acceptance S, which is acceptance for social value purposes. And then we have, very importantly, acceptance X, as in used by valuists, broadly speaking. This subscript notation, Imre Lakatos was very keen on. Mathematicians tend to use it. And others made fun of it. They thought it was inappropriate and unhelpful. And I guess they weren't mathematicians. I mean, you know, they really did. They thought it was really weird. What's he doing dividing Popper in his discussion, famously, into Popper 0, Popper 1, and Popper 2? Okay, Popper didn't like it, but other people would say, no, this doesn't help. Yes, it does. Analytically, in understanding Popper's work, Popper 0 was some sort of parody of Popper, in which the only thing he thinks is that theories are falsified, actually falsified, you know, sort of historically or something, which is blatantly not what he thinks. So let's call that Popper 0 and push that to one side. It's very helpful. So, subscripts, I recommend them. Why not? Okay, the essence of the talk, that's in a way all background, we've got plenty of time, I believe. What about the first argument? Oh, sorry, I meant to say that we're running back from, in terms of the stream, acceptance is the furthest one down the stream, then, sorry, acceptance of H, of the hypothesis, accepting in some way, some sense that dioxin is carcinogenic. This is the Rudner's regress case, when Rudner becomes worried, it is literally true, becomes worried that maybe his case, his argument about acceptance of the hypothesis is not quite convincing, because it has a response to it given by Jeffrey. He then says, but what about the acceptance of the probability? What about when you accept that this is the degree of support for the hypothesis? Somewhere, he says, Rudner's implying, there is this acceptance, and you never have epistemically sufficient reason to justify acceptance. So you'll have to bring in values. If you don't bring them in at ground level, you'll have to bring them in at a higher level. Well, not unconvincing, just not right in my opinion, and in Jeffrey's opinion. And then further upstream, almost everything else upstream is supposed to be value-laden as well, according to values. Okay. So it's kind of working upstream. Here is Rudner's argument in my form. I've already read it to you. I don't disagree with all of this. Oops, I I've read it to you already. It seems quite convincing. And I remember reading this and thinking something like, that's quite convincing. But it must be, you know, it's always this thing we do as philosophers, it must be wrong. Because I don't like the conclusion. You know, that's what we do. So then I looked at it, you know, very, very closely for many years. And in the end, with a bit of help from other philosophers, of course, I thought, yeah, that's right, it's not right, is it? But, you know, I was driven by my instinct that there was something wrong with it. You can't rely on instincts, but they drive us. There's the argument on the left. So what are the arguments here, or my argument against it? Well, see if I've bits I was going to read out here for you. Yeah, this is to a considerable extent 3 years later, after Rudner's argument is presented, Richard Jeffrey offers what a number of people, including Gregor Betz in a, I think, 2014 article, considered to be a very, very significant response to this Rudner's inductive risk argument. So Rudner's doing okay. Up to that point, these four stages with a bit of tidying up seem to be okay. It's something about the later bit where, of course, acceptance appears, and where Rudner uses, I think for the first time in his essay, surely, or of course, or obviously. So it's a kind of dilemma, depending what we mean by acceptance here. Do you remember the purple bit we talked about? This is the bit which I'll show you the whole of this so you can see where we're getting to, because I've said a little bit more than I expected in my practice runs already about this. Let's look at the two senses of acceptance here. That what I'll say we are saying, Jeffrey and me are saying, is that this bottom bit here is the social acceptance, where a person says, I've done my research, I've got something like a 0.8 highly likely, lots of support for dioxin as carcinogenic. I want to think carefully about what I'm saying here. And that person, let's call them scientists, now says to the press, or says to a politician, dioxin is carcinogenic. Which is quite a big step, as pointed out by valuists. Because it's underdetermined. We have not determined that dioxin is carcinogenic from our evidence. There is an epistemic or inductive gap here. And the person has crossed it on some basis, but it's not on an epistemic basis. Rudner's right about that. But of course, I'm talking about some person here. If this is a scientist, fair enough. But my proposal and Jeffrey's proposal is that that's not at the heart of science, that stage. The scientist, if you like, has gone beyond their brief to some extent in saying dioxin is carcinogenic. All they're justified epistemically, you might say from their profession, as saying, is dioxin has this sort of probability of being carcinogenic. And Rudner is playing on, that's not quite fair, Rudner has noticed that you have to bring in some sort of values if you're going to move from the probability to the categorical acceptance. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with it, if you like, is that it's not so significant to what I would call the heart of science, compared with what he thinks. So that's that kind of acceptance. Now, the what Jeffrey realized was that on that basis, what science, if you like, basically does, basically is a vague word, is it establishes the probabilities. Well, I guess Jeffrey was a probabilist, probably a Bayesian, and he published an essay just 3 years after Runner. He said, just look for the right quote, yeah. So Jeffrey writes that he rejects the widely held view that science consists of a body of hypotheses which have been accepted as highly enough confirmed for practical purposes. So he is very specifically focusing on the idea that this acceptance is at the edge of science, not somehow central to it. And he now faces a difficulty. And he's very well aware of the difficulty. And the difficulty is that scientists do seem to accept hypotheses. And he says, first of all, he says, the activity proper to science is the assignment of probabilities with respect to the currently available evidence to the hypothesis, which on the usual view, which he objects to, the scientist simply accepts or rejects. And then he writes, he's a good philosopher, interesting philosopher, at the end of his essay he writes calmly, this view is not fully satisfactory. It bears no resemblance, he writes, to our ordinary conception of science. It's almost as if he's toying with us, really. Books on electrodynamics, he writes, for example, simply list Maxwell's equations as laws. They don't add a degree of confirmation. Absolutely right. And this is in the final paragraph of his paper. So he's kind of toying with this. He says, maybe science only really epistemically establishes probabilities. I understand this is bizarre as a claim. It seems obvious that it can't be right if you actually look at science, but this is what he thinks it's doing. A few years later, in a step almost never referred to by anyone, as far as I can tell in the literature, Isaac Levy wrote a whole series of research papers on something, a series of, some of them were called something like On the Importance of Mistakes, something like that. And he solved this problem. He solved this problem of Jeffrey's. As to how come you do seem to get acceptance, surely, within science, epistemically. And what he argued was that, in fact, epistemic utilities, as opposed to social ones, are involved in academic acceptance. So Jeffrey uses a very simple decision theory model in which you have probability that dioxin is, just in a table, probability that dioxin is carcinogenic, probability it isn't carcinogenic, benefits, social benefits of some utility, if we decide to ban it, social benefits, if we decide not to ban it, or harms, but it turns out that it is carcinogenic, social harm of not banning it when it turns out it isn't carcinogenic, so on and so on. Getting an expected utility at the end. And Levy says, well, I think he says the same thing happens internally, academically, except that in that case, the utilities are things like the community thinking, how bad would it be, not socially, how bad would it be within our community if we put into our textbooks and teach in our lectures that dioxin is carcinogenic, and then later in the evidence comes in that it isn't. How bad would it be if we didn't put it in, but in fact it is carcinogenic? Not bad for society, just bad for us. Embarrassing, if you like, for the growth of knowledge. And Levy used exactly the same rational choice approach, but he was using it very explicitly, epistemically, but not epistemically in the sense of prefer hypotheses which have successfully made novel fact predictions. Not that kind of epistemic method. Epistemic in the sense of involving claims like, not claims, feelings, values within the community. We would prefer not to have lots of statements in our textbooks which turn out not to be supported later on. Well, I'm convinced by that. And that solves Jeffrey's problem about probabilism, if you can call it that. It means that the epistemic procedures using epistemic methods in science stop with the probabilities. And acceptance is always another stage, and it's either involves importing social values, or it involves importing epistemic values or utilities in this sense. But that's always a step beyond where the power of epistemic guidance methods stops. This tidies up Jeffrey's view in what I consider to be a very, very convincing way. Is Rudner so focused on this practical aspect, if you like? Well, this is unfair, perhaps, but he was working at the time, perfectly good philosopher, at the Tufts College System Coordination Project at the Naval Research Laboratory. And people have noticed that all his examples are very, very practical, to do with what is very nearly policy making. He says, the examples sort of apologizes, the examples I've chosen are from scientific inference in industrial quality control, he says, but, they point clearly to general application. No, they don't, in my opinion. They point clearly to the application of the probabilities that he's talking about in very, very practical circumstances, I think. So that's my view, not even my view really, of course it's a combination of Jeffrey's view and Isaac Levy's view. What I've done is put the two together. So I think that the argument that hypotheses, that the acceptance of hypotheses involves values, and that this is a critical part of science, is curiously slightly right, of course, and mostly wrong, in the sense that either it involves epistemic values, in which case it's just internal to the truth-seeking, basically, or it's much more practical and arguably not core to science at all. Now we have the regress. Remember the three arguments? I've got an hour on time, but we're okay. The regress argument was the one that, well, Rudner says if it's not acceptance of the hypothesis involving values, it's acceptance of the probability involving values. You can't get away with it, Thonemann, he seems to be saying. And he puts this in because he knows this is something like Jeffrey's response to his article is going to appear. He knows it is. So, yeah, got that. That's it, that's just what I've been going on about. This is Rudner's response. So basically, the extent of evidential support is itself accepted and therefore will have to involve, and therefore not fully justified epistemically, and therefore is going to have to involve social values. Just a reminder, this is how I would have thought we, in physics or in medicine, obtain the probability, the degree of support some combination of background knowledge, observations, the hypothesis, a judgment, and some rough value coming out at the end. Well, basically, to cut it fairly short, my argument, and not only mine, I think, but maybe perhaps to some extent mine, is that we don't accept, in any usual sense of accept or useful sense, the probability. We judge it. We judge the size of it based on the available evidence. And one line of thought, which I would like to put into your mind, I talked about this footnote in Heather Douglas's work. She never talks about value inconsequential science. Fair enough. But if we look at the science that leads to, let's say, the claim that there's a 0.8 probability that pulsars are spinning neutron stars. So there's the probability, which is at the end of the research paper. If that is epistemically unsupported, but also if we have no social value input, because it is of no social value, ex hypothesi, how do scientists ever come up with this probability? Is it just some sort of wild guess? The relevance in this topic of looking at value, looking at research into value inconsequential hypotheses is very great. Because if there's all these inductive gaps in science, how is value inconsequential science possible? Because you can't paper over these gaps with social values, because there aren't any social values involved. And yet, value inconsequential science, in say lots of physics, operates, as far as we can tell, perfectly successfully to truth claims at the end. So it doesn't seem necessary to bring in values. There don't seem to be the inductive gaps. And there doesn't seem to be one here. It seems that we can judge, using our epistemic methods, what the probability is that pulsars are neutron stars, and also that dioxin is carcinogenic, despite its value consequences. So that's the argument I presented orally. Note, possibility, is it possible to make the judgment that dioxin is very likely to be carcinogenic based on epistemic methods? I think so, yes. Is it responsible to make it using only epistemic methods? A different point that we haven't specially raised since we talked a bit about the problem we were tackling. I suggest that, you can read there, I suggest that the truth benefits society, hardly a very startling claim, and that we want to get at the truth, not only the hypothesis itself, but the probability of the hypothesis. We want our best available methods for establishing the truth first, and then we pass it out to society, because it's really useful to have the truth. And at this point, I join in with David Papineau and all sorts of other philosophers who, of course, think something like that, of course. And yeah, I don't need to read that quote of Stephen John. There are people who don't agree with me. Heather Douglas. Non-epistemic values are logically needed for reasoning in science. Even in the internal stages of science, whatever internal means. And there are people who object to that, but logically needed. If it's logically needed, how does value inconsequential research proceed? I think she has no answer to that, certainly no written answer, because she just isn't interested in it. She never refers to it. Finally, and fairly briefly, to finish off with, the upstream argument. Underdetermination, essentially. Direct and indirect is Heather Douglas's terms. So the idea is the value input piles up in the upstream stages. So by the time you get to the, your extent of evidential support, it's infected, I would say infected, it's imbued with social values. How many of these stages? Well, Matthew Brown again, because I've been writing about him. Of the decisions scientists make, few, if any, can in principle be decided by logic and evidence alone. Nor are epistemic standards sufficient. His short list of the stages of investigation where the contingent, as he calls them, choices have to be made, comprises 28 separate stages, quote, and so on. Again, quite an extreme claim, in my opinion. Don't worry about the pile of papers here, by the way. Almost everything that's left is these extra topics, if you feel like talking about them after the end of the talk. Here's my response to this, which finishes the talk. There's a dilemma. And briefly, the dilemma is, I'm not rushing, it is fairly brief. The dilemma is, if we have a stage where the input of values has no effect downstream on the 0.8, as in the degree of support for dioxin being carcinogenic is 0.8. If it doesn't, I have to express this a little carefully, if it doesn't affect the 0.8, it doesn't matter. And if it does affect the 0.8, this is, in my modest opinion, a bit of a contribution to the debate. If it does affect the 0.8, because of decisions that the scientist has made for socially responsible reasons, you see where this is going? So that it becomes 0.9, it's not a probability any longer. It's not a degree of support. It's just a number. You've messed up the science by bringing in the values in this upstream stage. Either you haven't messed it up, in which case it doesn't matter, or you have actually caused the 0.9 to change, which would be 0.8 to 0.9, which is interesting, but catastrophic. Because you've now got, you haven't got probability of the hypothesis is now 0.9, because you've been socially responsible, and so you can pass on the 0.9 to policymakers. You haven't got anything to pass on to the policymakers. Your science has disintegrated, it's slipped through your fingers. You have killed the goose that lays the golden eggs. It's a dilemma. Either it's affected or it isn't. The 0.8. So in the scientists advised by the philosopher, if the scientist has decided to classify the uncertain observation of the rat's liver as carcinogenic, because Heather Douglas and other valuers say this is the right thing for scientists to do, to be socially responsible. It's, if you like, short-sighted. In the moment, it feels right to the scientists to do that. But they need philosophical education or something. Because that's only in the moment. What they've done is wrecked their research. And the result they come up with is of no value. Is of no value, not only no value epistemically in terms of textbooks, it's of no value to politicians and decision makers. It's completely ruined by the scientist trying to be socially responsible.